Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So here we are again, Scott, the end of a kind of a busy week for both of us. We were just commenting we've both done a bunch of talking this week.
Yeah, we made it through a conference and a user group, and, we had the pleasure of presenting at both, but throat is a little bit shot.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll crank through this episode and be on with the rest of our day.
Yeah, it's going to be a tea kind of day, so we'll see. I'm going to channel my inner Oprah or whatever my wife gets, the stuff that's downstairs.
Oh, yeah, exactly. All right. So tea, coffee, scratchy voices. What do you want to talk about for a topic?
Let's go ahead. We did Skype for Business. So let's talk about the other side of kind of messaging and collab and hit up Exchange. Everybody's favorite, just a little bit of email.
Yeah, and there's just a few things with Exchange. We'll start with probably a higher level overview, and there's some certain topics we could probably spend a whole episode on sometime in the future.
It's a deep one, right? So I think just to set the context, Exchange has a lot of things in it. It has some add-ons that we'll try and touch on. So Exchange Online Protection or Advanced Threat Protection, and we'll throw a bunch of acronyms and things like that out there. But for the most part, I think we can kind of at least rail through the service description side of things. And here's what you get with what you're paying for in a couple of different SKUs and kind of go at it from there.
All right. Sounds good. So to kind of kick things off, like you said, the service description, Exchange Online is pretty much included. Well, it's included in every SKU out there, from the business essentials side, enterprise side, even the frontline workers or kiosk worker side. Any of those bundled packages include Exchange. It may vary some on what features you get. Like you said, some of the add-ons and some of the features that are available may differ between those. And then in addition to kind of having it included in all of those plans, there's also some standalone Exchange plans. So if you want to have a user that just has email, or for some reason you don't need the whole bundle, you can do just Exchange plans too. They have a couple different ones. I think it's Exchange Online Plan 1 and Plan 2. When you go look at the service description, it compares a whole bunch of different features across the suites, as well as those Exchange Online Plan 1 and Plan 2, the Exchange Online Kiosk, and even does some comparison with Exchange Server 2013, 2016. So there's a lot of different options there. We won't try to cover all of the features and what's included. We'll put a link out there to the service description where you can even go look at these tables for yourself and really try to help narrow down from the fine-grained feature perspective what you need, what you're looking for, what plans will be suitable from that Exchange perspective.
We've never really talked about the service description. I think that's an awesome tool that everyone should know about, especially if you kind of deploy these services and have to understand things like, hey, what's my RTO and RPO and all those good things for Exchange? So, or SharePoint or OneDrive for Business or Skype. So all that information is in there. Typically, the URLs are pretty long. Just kind of pro tip. So Microsoft did buy somebody bought a shorter domain. So you just go to Office365SD.com, and that'll dump you straight into the big overall service description, and then you can check out Exchange and all the little things that live underneath it. I also think you mentioned something that's pretty important, that you can mix and match SKUs and licensing. We've touched on that before. Email is something that everybody needs, but you might already have other services someplace else. Or we were talking to somebody earlier this week who had an Office 365 home subscription, but they wanted some more kind of enterprise grade email. So you can just buy that Exchange license and go ahead and deploy Office 365 and have access to the same things that people do in their E3s and E5s and everything else for a pretty minimal cost. I mean, you're talking anything from, like $5 per user per month. So for $60 a year, you too can have enterprise email for a single user, which I think is super powerful. Or if you think about mixing and matching even within your own organization, Not every user might need Office on their desktop or even Office Online, but you probably have a whole bunch that do need things like just email. So you can keep your costs lower that way.
That's a nice feature. And like you said, I actually do that for one of my email accounts too. One of my email addresses, I just pay for an Exchange Online. I think I pay for the plan one for $5 a month, $60 a year. I get a ton of features, more than I'm going to get in some of the other options. It's not free, but for $60, it includes a lot of benefits.
We've kind of gone through that. Let's talk about deployment real quick. So deployment for Exchange Online, super simple, right? Microsoft's pretty much going to walk you through the process. You're going to have a custom domain. So let's go ahead and be Contoso again today. So you're going to be contoso.com, and you're going to go and set up some DNS records to verify that you own Contoso.com and associate that with your Office 365 tenant. And then you're going to go in and configure some other records specifically around Exchange. So you're going to need some MX records that point over to Microsoft's email services, and they'll provide you all the guidance there for, hey, here's the MX record, here's the time to live, here's the host you need that pointed to, and all that good kind of stuff. And they'll provide verification too before you start spinning up those services and kind of getting things to work, right? So if you don't verify that domain, you're going to have email addresses in your on Microsoft.com domain, kind of your default namespace. So you're probably going to want to have the branded experience and go ahead, verify a domain, configure MX records, and change that domain over to your default domain in Office 365. So as new mailboxes are provisioned or synced in, they're going to come in with the right proxy addresses and things like that.
It's super simple. So one other thing to think about kind of as you're onboarding some of those users, looking at some of this, is there's also some Exchange Online limits, just like with all the services. Microsoft can't make it wide open. They can't give you unlimited resources. So there's also some limits you want to be aware of, things you want to think about when you start onboarding users. Some things are a real advantage, such as mailbox size. So one of my favorites, the very minimum. So these really... Well, I guess the very minimum is the kiosk plan, where you only get 2 gigs of storage for your user mailbox. But some of these other ones, all the business plans, 50 gigs for your user mailbox. E1 is 50 gigs, E3, E5, you get 100 gigs per mailbox. So this isn't 100 gigs to share. This is 100 gigs per person per mailbox. That's huge. I know you have a lot of users that you manage at your organization. We were talking earlier and you're like, there's absolutely no way I would want to try to host Exchange and give users that large of a mailbox in an on-prem environment.
Scale is certainly something that comes into play, and scale changes over time too. So for some of those things, like E3s and E5s used to only get 50 gigs for their mailbox, and that's been increased over time. It's 100 gigs today. And then there's also options to have things in most Exchange plans to have what's called like an online archive or an archive mailbox associated with you. So effectively have some retention rules and retention policies that kick in to automatically move everything in my mailbox and Scott's mailbox over to his online archive. Think like a PST, but it's online all the time and it has way more space automatically, right? And keep everything organized and in the same folders, all that good stuff. So those come with their own set of limitations. So, you know, those small business plans, business essentials, business premium, you get like 50 gig archives there. The E1's the same thing. When you step up into the E3s and E5s, you are going to get unlimited archive. And Microsoft announced this, I think a couple of years ago now, and they've had some trouble rolling it out. But really what happens is in practice, you end up with 100 gig primary, and you end up with, as far as you can take it, 170 gig archive. So 270 gigs of email storage per person out of the gate, like nothing for you to do. And then if you do want more space, because you're in one of those SKUs where you pay for unlimited archive, you just open a service request with Microsoft and you say, hey, extend the mailbox by this much, and they'll go ahead and extend it out for you. So depending on your tenant, where your tenant sits. In some cases, they can't scale past that 170 yet. But so your mileage may vary, but it's super simple and it's all just sitting there ready to go for you. So in an organization where you have 1,000 users and you've got 100 gigs per user and then optionally another 170 gigs per user, that's just a ton of storage that's really hard to manage on-prem, let alone keep it up operationally, right? Like you're going to have trouble keeping that highly available. That's a big Exchange environment for that much data. Let Microsoft handle it for you. And it's dirt cheap.
Yeah. So what you're telling me is I can now keep all of my email that I've ever gotten forever, and nobody will ever tell me I have to purge my mailbox.
Something like that. Hopefully your company has a retention policy and electronic records and all that good kind of stuff. There are some downstream impacts too to having such large limits on mailbox sizes. So if you think about something like typically email, we don't access it just through a web browser. So we're not going into OA in the case of Exchange and saying, hey, let's work exclusively out of here. You tend to work out of something on your desktop, like Outlook as a client. And Outlook as a client has its own set of limitations. So in this world where I can have a 100 gig primary mailbox, I have a 50 gig OST limitation on Outlook on Windows, right? So I can never actually physically cache all the information in my mailbox, let alone in my archive too, locally on my PC. So you have to reset some expectations and potentially take a look at your configurations and things like that. So try and keep kind of that end user side of things in mind too, because there are some impacts on them. You get all this nice storage, but their life changes a little bit along the way as well.
Yeah. And something else along those lines, like you said, with that client on their desktops, if they have that 50 gig mailbox, if they get a new PC, if you are doing a migration, something like that, you also have to keep in mind that now the first time those users go to connect to their Exchange Online mailbox, kind of as we've mentioned before, it's no longer pulling it across your local network. It's going out across the internet and using your internet pipe to grab all those mailboxes. So envision 10, 20, 50, whatever you may have users, if they all go connect to Exchange Online at the same time and they're all trying to pull down a 50 gig mailbox, that can put quite a burden on your internet pipe as they're trying to pull that down. So as we've said before in other episodes, as you're looking at some of this stuff, definitely be aware of that internet pipe too and the effect that different actions can have when it comes to your end users accessing all of this content that's now stored online.
Yeah, it's an interesting world. So real quick, some of the other limit stuff too. So shared mailboxes, the published documentation says 50 gigs for those. I've seen in the tenants that I manage, which tend to be all eSKUs, so E3s and E5s, I'm seeing shared mailboxes that are being provisioned at 100 gigs today, just like user mailboxes. So, I have an existing subset that are stuck at 50, and my new ones are coming in at 100. Resource mailboxes, limited to 50 gigs as well. Site mailboxes have been deprecated, but if you do happen to have those laying around, still 50 gigs there. And then public folders are their own kind of beast. You can have a bunch of those, but those individual mailbox databases, they can scale up to 100 gigs. So kind of when you're planning split there and what lives in what databases. Oh, and group mailboxes, right? Office 365 groups that have those shared inboxes, 50 gigs for those as well.
There's some more limits too. I mean, you have some of the things around file size attachments, message size limits. I think there's even a limit on the number of outgoing emails you can send in a day. So if you plan on trying to use your mailbox for spamming people, probably not going to work. I know it's high. I don't know. Here it is, 3,600 messages per hour.
That's for received. For outbound, when you're sending, it's 10,000 recipients per day.
There it is. I was looking at the wrong ones. If you can manage to send emails to 10,000 people per day, you got to figure something else out. Somebody needs more time.
You'd be surprised.
I think that really covers some of the limits. Oh, some of the retention periods. There's some retention periods too when it comes to deleted items folder, junk email folder, in terms of how long things can sit around there. Again, some of that stuff can be changed, but go take a look at this. We'll link up the Exchange Online limits in the show notes and go have a look at it, look through it. Again, make sure you're not going to run into you don't have some crazy scenario that's going to cause you to have issues if you decide you want to go to Exchange Online.
Yeah, perfect. So with that in mind, let's kind of take a quick break and get a word in from our sponsor, BitWizards.
You love technology, so do we. You're an experienced IT pro. We respect that. You're a problem solver. We've got clients. You need a tan. We've got a beach. You love Azure. We love Azure. At BitWizards, we've won Florida Trend Magazine's Best Companies to Work For 8 years running and have been a Microsoft Gold partner since 2001. I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like we were meant for each other. Go to bitwizards.com/cloudsmith to introduce yourself.
So we're back. Awesome. And let's go ahead and kind of keep going down the path and talk about some of the other things you can do. So you basically have a full-blown Exchange environment. You're just letting Microsoft manage the underpinnings for you. So you can do all the same things that you do in on-prem Exchange up in Office 365 as well. So you do have access to things like creating resources. So whether you do rooms, whether you do equipment, anything like that, you can also still do things like room and equipment lists to make kind of groupings in Outlook and when you're leveraging the scheduling assistant a little bit cleaner. You also have things like contacts that come into play. So you can go ahead and do those external recipients and contacts the same way you would have done in the past, except you don't end up with the stubbed accounts sitting on-prem. If you happen to be in a hybrid or things like that. So watch which side you create your contacts on. And all that stuff gets populated into your global address list, which you still continue to sync back and be able to search and consume and make changes where you need to. So there's not too many material changes there. Clients still sync once a day. They get their cache copy for like OAB and all that kind of stuff.
Again, it's super nice. You get that full Exchange environment. You don't really have to manage it. So another thing that users might be interested in is, great, I have this Exchange environment, it's up, it's going. What type of things do I have from a reporting perspective? How can I manage what my users are doing? If they're sending a bunch of email, how much they're receiving, the size of their mailbox? Microsoft includes all of these types of reports too, both from a usage perspective, as well as from some of that security and compliance standpoint about how much spam is hitting my environment a day, what type of malware is trying to get into my environment. So there's a whole bunch of reporting. Again, email activity, usage reports. You can see mailbox usage, email activity, like I said, how many sent messages per user, how many received, how many of those they actually read. And then from that security and compliance side, there's a whole bunch of other reports in the Security and Compliance Center. So one thing, you may have to move around a little bit to see some of these different reports. Some of those usage reports are right in the Office 365 Admin Center. Some of those more security-based reports are actually over in that Security and Compliance Center, where you can see things like DLP policy matches, which we may hit on DLP a little bit later in this episode. Some of the threat protection, malware, your top senders and receivers, spoof mail, all kinds of different reports there. And then a third area you can actually look at, and I think we've hit on this before, is in that search and investigation, that audit log search. So if you've turned on your unified audit logging and you want to audit certain activities within Exchange, you can look at all kinds of different audit reports within Exchange, whether it's created and received mail, whether it's mailboxes that are purged from a mailbox, users signing into different mailboxes. So if you think one of your users' mailboxes has been compromised and you want to see when they're signing in, who's signing into different mailboxes, it gets into even things like delegation mailbox permissions. When delegate mailbox permissions has been removed or added, messages sent as send as. So around Exchange, you get a whole slew of other activities, statistics that you can report on when you're looking at Exchange and trying to manage it, audit it, see what's really going on in that Exchange Online environment.
Yeah, one of the other things you can do there as well is you can automate those reports so that they get sent out on say you want them every week or every month or kind of daily things. So I know in the past, sometimes operationally, you just want to know what's going on. So things like your mail flow reports, you might want to get daily just to keep a kind of a gut check on, hey, did we have a big spike in traffic, or, was there something we missed? And also kind of the spam and malware reports, just so you can get an idea of what's going on there. So if you're just in the default Exchange SKUs, there's kind of like Exchange and malware, there's like spam and malware blocking light, but it's really not doing a whole lot for you, right? It's not actively preventing or scanning URLs and attachments and all those kinds of things. So you might need to keep a much better handle on what's going on and what comes into play there. So all that being said, while it is kind of like vanilla Exchange, you can do some add-ons as well to make your life a little bit better. So you can do one of the big ones that I would say probably a lot of organizations might look at first is Exchange Online Protection, or EOP. So that'll add a whole set of kind of a whole new area to Exchange admin for you, where you can do things like do blocked and allowed senders or domains for things to go into a quarantine. You actually will pick up a full quarantine for your users. So that's all awesome. It's going to give you some better heuristics and control around things like spam. So do you want to assign certain like BCL scores to things coming in? If you're leveraging transport rules to set headers, you can put those in combination with EOP, get your life a little bit better. And it'll also add in blocked attachments. So you'll be able to block .docx files or things, or like .js files, all that good kind of stuff right out of the gate, so it doesn't come in. So you'll basically say, hey, I only want to allow these types, and then everything else will go ahead and be blocked. Microsoft does do some light malware scanning and things on their end, but to be honest, if you're just in EOP land, it doesn't pick up just about anything, right? It's going to let a ton of stuff through, and you're really going to have to go in and tweak it. I think one of the big frustrations I've seen with everybody when they do EOP is they step in thinking it's going to be like a holistic security solution for them, and it's going to work right out of the gate without any configuration. And that's not the case at all. EOP can be great. Well, it can at least be good, if not great, but you do have to put a bunch of time into configuring it and tweaking it so that it meets kind of your operational and organizational requirements.
Again, my tenant, I don't tweak it a lot, but I just have a couple email boxes in mine. But I have seen there's spam that gets through. I end up tweaking it, modifying it, but it's a great solution. And one thing that users may not even realize, I actually have one customer that has a bunch of Office 365 E3 licenses. They're working on migrating their email to it. It's not there yet, but they're actually still using EOP with their on-premises Exchange. So some of these features like EOP and even archiving, you can even tie into your Exchange Online or your Exchange on-prem environment, especially if you're looking at migrating to the cloud, but you're not quite there yet. So another aspect of this too, you mentioned it doesn't do some of the things with safe links, safe attachments. There's another add-on for Exchange Online to increase that protection even more called Advanced Threat Protection. What does that include? What does the Advanced Threat Protection get you on top of that EOP?
So at a kind of really high level, it adds two features, super simple. So it starts to do link scanning. So if you've ever received an HTML formatted email and it has a link in it that goes to like a known bad source, it's going to add a link scanning in there and prevent clicking of those links and kind of flag them through on the system side. It's also going to do active attachment scanning for malware. So where on the Exchange or the EOP side, it's like malware scanning light and it's letting a bunch of stuff through. On the ATP side, it's going to stop a lot more of that. Really in the background, it's Proofpoint going. So you're going to see things like for like link scanning, you're going to start to see like the url.proofpointdefense.com kind of stuff coming into play to route phishing messages and all the other things that come into play. ATP is another one of those where if you're in hybrid, it does provide you kind of the cross-premises coverage because all your mail flow is going through Exchange Online and Office 365 at that point. But it is, like you said, an additive thing. It's an additional add-on. If you're in the E3 space, it's an add-on. And if you're E5s, ATP is included in that SKU.
Yeah, and I really like it. One, it can have one side effect, especially with the safe attachments. And Microsoft has worked to make this a little bit better. But it used to be that if you were using ATP and you had safe attachments, sometimes your mail would get delayed because essentially if it's unsure about an attachment, it actually would stop that email grab that attachment, spin it up in some container on their servers, actually check that attachment for malware, make sure it was safe before it let that email go to your inbox. So typically you would see email delayed about 10 minutes, sometime up to 30 minutes. Recently, and I can't remember how long ago, maybe 6 months ago or so, even longer, they tweaked that a little bit where it can actually still send the email on. So you know the email's there, you get the email, but you may not be able to actually access that attachment right away. It's kind of a placeholder in the email while they're doing some of that scanning on that attachment to make sure it's safe before you can actually access that attachment that's on that email. So again, just something to be aware of if you're looking at turning on ATP, you want to use those safe attachments. It can have a little bit of effect on your end users in terms of that attachment in particular making it to their mailbox.
Again, it's that kind of downstream user impact thing, right? You implement a system and people have to use it. So you have to keep all those things in mind. And hopefully, if you're the Exchange admin in your org, you actually have a mailbox and you're experiencing some of this stuff too. So it shouldn't all be kind of foreign to you when you sit down and get into it on day one.
One last topic before we wrap up for the day is what happens when a user leaves? If I have to deactivate their account, does their mailbox get deleted? What options do I have when it comes to making sure I preserve some of that email? What all happens when a user leaves and their account gets deactivated to their mailbox?
I'll give you the classic consulting answer. It depends, right? Depending on your SKU and kind of how you deploy it and features and functionality. So typically, in most organizations, you're probably going to want to retain that data for just a little bit, even just so like a manager can have access to it or something else can happen. So you can leave that account around and go ahead and just disable the account and block it from signing in, but you're still going to leave a license assigned to it. It's going to be stubbed out. It's going to be sitting there. It's still going to be a full-blown mailbox. The other thing that you can do is if you want to free that license up and get that license back that was associated with that mailbox, and you don't have needs around like legal holds or anything like that, you can go ahead and convert that user mailbox to a shared mailbox and then go ahead and release the license. So don't delete the account, leave it disabled and not able to sign in, all those kinds of things, but go ahead and just convert it over to a shared mailbox. Go ahead, add your delegates, if you're going to set up forwarders, do all that kind of stuff. So you keep the stub around and the mailbox can live because the alias is still there and it's all set and good to go. If you do want to get rid of the mailbox all the way, just delete the account and the mailbox goes away. It goes into a recycle bin, basically retained for 30 days. If you do need to get it back, recreate the account, reassociate it. And for the most part, you're back up and running and ready to go once you've assigned a license and done all those things that need to be done there.
All right. Sounds good. Well, that about does it on time. Again, there's lots more Exchange topics we can talk about. We'll definitely do another episode where we can maybe dive into hybrid, dive into some of the DLP, IRM stuff around it. But for now, we'll talk to you later.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben.
If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening.